Don Goldman and Pam Bondi never imagined their paths would collide in a moment this explosive. One was pressing for straight answers. The other was being accused of hiding files the public has been demanding for years. But the real jolt didn't come from the argument itself. It came from a single detail Goldman revealed, one that instantly changed the mood in the room. For a full 30 seconds, everything went silent. Viewers froze. Because what he uncovered about the Epstein files wasn't just awkward or embarrassing. It had the potential to crack open one of the most closely protected political secrets of modern times. And yet, here we are once again. The Homeland Security Committee is supposedly conducting oversight of the president and his administration. In theory, that's exactly what Congress should be doing. There are countless issues this administration deserves to be questioned on. Donald Trump ran his campaign promising to identify and deport the worst of the worst, criminals who were unlawfully in the country. That was the message voters heard. But what we are seeing now looks very different from what was promised. Instead, unidentified, masked ICE agents are detaining immigrants directly from courtrooms. These are not violent criminals. These are not dangerous offenders. Many are nonviolent, non-criminal immigrants who are actively following legal pathways to remain in the United States. Some are complying with asylum rules, others are permanent residents, and yet they are being arrested, held in harsh conditions, and in some cases reportedly deported. Despite being in the country legally, you would think the committee with direct jurisdiction over the Department of Homeland Security would be demanding answers. You would expect them to investigate why DHS is blocking members of Congress from inspecting detention facilities. After all, there is a clear federal statute that allows both Democrats and Republicans to conduct oversight of any facility that detains immigrants. The law is not optional, and yet DHS has refused to comply. So here we sit in a Homeland Security Committee hearing, even though this administration is actively undermining Congress's own legal authority. One would assume the Republican majority would object to that kind of executive overreach. But instead of focusing on what is happening right now, the discussion is once again centered on Joe Biden. Let's be clear, Joe Biden is not the president. He hasn't held that office for 7 months. If oversight is the goal, why are hearings still focused on the previous administration while the current one is detaining lawful permanent residents and in some cases even U.S. citizens? And the situation goes even deeper. This isn't only about ICE. FBI agents are reportedly being pulled away from critical work terrorism investigations, violent gang cases, child trafficking operations to assist IAs in arresting and detaining immigrants who pose no violent threat and who have legal asylum claims. That does not make the country safer. It does the opposite. It weakens national security by diverting resources away from real criminal threats. That raises a serious question for FBI Director Kash Patel. How? Many trained criminal investigators are being reassigned from protecting Americans to participate in immigration enforcement actions against non-criminal individuals trying to follow the law. These are questions that deserve real answers, not political distractions, and it doesn't stop there. Some of these detainees are being held in Bureau of Prisons facilities locations so severe that even convicted criminals are often deemed unfit to remain there long term. These are the conditions being imposed on people who have not committed violent crimes, who have not been convicted of anything, and who in many cases are simply trying to immigrate legally. This is the reality unfolding right now. And if Congress is serious about oversight, this is where the focus should be. We should be hearing directly from Pam Bondi about how much of the Department of Justice's time, money, and manpower is being spent detaining nonviolent, non-criminal immigration detainees. That alone deserves serious oversight. And while she is before Congress, there is another urgent question the American people are still waiting to have answered. What is really happening with the Epstein files? Donald Trump publicly promised those files would be released. Pam Bondi herself said the documents were sitting on her desk and that she planned to make them public in the name of transparency. Kash Patel spent years criticizing the FBI and demanding the release of the Epstein records. Many Republican lawmakers loudly called for those files to be made public. They insisted Americans had a right to know. But now, after a months-long internal review, Bondi and Patel suddenly claim there is nothing to see here. No evidence worth releasing. No information about accomplices, co-conspirators, or anyone else connected to Epstein's network. Then came another twist. Just yesterday, Republicans voted against releasing the Epstein files. That raises an obvious question. What changed? The answer is uncomfortable. Donald Trump's past relationship with Jeffrey Epstein is well documented. He flew on Epstein's plane. He attended parties with him. He spoke positively about him in the past. Now, more people are openly claiming that. Trump's name appears in the Epstein files. Some journalists say there are videos involving Trump. Elon Musk even stated publicly that Trump is blocking the release of the files because he appears in them. Pam Bondi insists there is nothing there. But Donald Trump himself has acknowledged that evidence exists, he just claims it is not credible and says it is fabricated. That statement came directly from a Truth Social post published at 9:43 this morning. Whether intentional or not, it reads like an admission that Trump is, in fact, mentioned in the Epstein files. And the American people deserve to know the truth. What followed next only added fuel to the fire. As the discussion intensified, procedural chaos took over. Motions were raised. Time was cut short. The chairman moved to table the discussion. Debate was shut down. The moment was buried under rules and technicalities. But if even a fraction of what was said is accurate, then someone has been working extremely hard to keep these documents locked away from public view. Don Goldman did not ease into this confrontation. He walked into the hearing and immediately turned everything upside down. Before anyone could settle into their seats, he forced the focus where it wasn't expected. This committee was supposed to be conducting real oversight of the current administration. Instead, Goldman highlighted what many had been trying to avoid. Reports are stacking up about secretive detention practices. Masked agents pulling nonviolent immigrants out of courtrooms. People with legal immigration pathways being detained without justification. Facilities so poorly maintained that even some officials privately admit they are not fit to house anyone. This was supposed to be the focus of the hearing, and Goldman made sure everyone in the room and everyone watching understood just how far the conversation had drifted from the truth. But instead of focusing on any of those urgent issues, the majority chose to spend their time fixated on a former administration that has not been in power for months. Goldman made it clear he was done pretending this was normal. He reminded everyone in the room that while lawmakers were chasing old political headlines, real families were being torn apart in real time. Legal residents, asylum seekers, and according to multiple attorneys, even U.S. citizens were being pulled into a system that refused to allow Congress to inspect what was happening inside. There is a federal statute that explicitly requires the Department of Homeland Security to permit oversight visits by members of Congress from both parties. That law exists for a reason. Yet reports indicate those doors remained closed. Goldman painted a disturbing picture: masked agents taking people off the streets, loading them into vans, and holding them in detention centers the public is not allowed to see. At the same time, trained criminal investigators were being reassigned from serious cases involving terrorism, gang violence, and human trafficking to assist in rounding up nonviolent individuals who posed no threat to public safety. The tension in the room was already thick. But none of that was what truly changed everything. The moment that shifted the hearing, when the air seemed to leave the room, was when Goldman mentioned Pam Bondi. Her name hit hard. Bondi was not just any former attorney general. She was the official who once publicly said the Epstein files were sitting on her desk. She was the one who promised to release them in the name of transparency. She was the same person who told the public they deserved the truth, until suddenly that promise disappeared, the review ended, the conclusion was delivered. According to Bondi and others, there was nothing there. No accomplices, no co-conspirators, No powerful figures the public needed to know about. Just empty space where explosive revelations were once promised. For anyone who remembered the original statements, the shift made no sense. How did an investigation said to include hundreds of gigabytes of material suddenly result in a claim that there was nothing worth releasing? How did the loudest voices calling for transparency become the same voices arguing there was no longer any reason to look? Goldman didn't soften his words. He said out loud what millions of people have been asking quietly online. The silence doesn't add up. Not after years of insisting the Epstein files would expose people who believed they were untouchable. Not after nonstop demands to reveal who was involved, who enabled it, and who benefited. And absolutely not after repeated public claims that those files would name names and finally answer questions. Survivors have carried for decades, but the real shock, the moment that froze the room, came next. Goldman read from a post published earlier that very morning. A post that acknowledged in plain terms that evidence does exist, not that the claims were true, not that they were credible, but that the evidence exists. That specific wording grabbed everyone's attention immediately. It sounded like an admission, an acknowledgement that the former president appears in the Epstein files, followed by a dismissal of the allegations as unbelievable. Whether the claims were accurate or not almost became secondary. What mattered was that, for the first time, someone openly recognized their own presence in the material after years of speculation. Years of denials and years of constantly shifting explanations. It came down to a single sentence that confirmed what so many people had long suspected. And that wasn't the only spark added to the fire. Online discussions were already raging. Reporters claimed they had spoken with individuals who said they had seen videos involving topless women. Commentators pointed to the existence of sensitive recordings connected to powerful figures. Then came the most explosive suggestion of all, delivered by one of the largest voices on the internet. Elon Musk publicly implied that the former president was blocking the release of the Epstein files. He offered no proof, but the statement alone was enough to ignite a storm of theories, threads, and nonstop debate across every major platform. Many labeled the claim unverified. Others dismissed it outright. But it still pushed millions of people to ask the same question. If there is truly nothing in those files, why fight so aggressively to keep them sealed? Goldman was careful with his words. He wasn't accusing anyone of crimes. He wasn't presenting rumors as established fact. What he did was point to the reality of the public conversation, the nonstop speculation, the conflicting narratives, the way the story kept changing direction. And his message was clear. Transparency does not vanish without a reason. Then came the question that shattered the carefully controlled tone of the hearing. Why were the Epstein files buried? Why did Pam Bondi promise transparency, publicly swear the truth would come out, and then quietly close the vault? Why did the same people who spent years demanding the release of those files suddenly vote against making them public? What changed? Goldman pressed further. What exactly happened during the review? Who did Bondi speak with while it was underway? What internal communications took place inside the department? Why did officials who once styled themselves as champions of exposing corruption now insist there was nothing worth seeing? The majority tried to redirect the conversation. They attempted to interrupt. They pushed to move on. But Goldman refused to back down. He laid out the timeline. He highlighted the contradictions. He reminded the room that the American people had been told for years that these files contained answers survivors deserved, answers lawmakers demanded, and answers the public was promised. And now, those answers were sealed behind a wall of silence. He turned directly toward one of the committee members and made his position unmistakably clear. Subpoenas were already moving forward. He wanted records. He wanted internal emails and communication logs. He wanted every document tied to the Epstein file review: who was consulted, who made the decisions, who drafted the public statements, and who ultimately signed off on the conclusion. His reasoning was simple and direct. The truth does not need to be hidden. Only secrets do. The tension in the room continued to build as Goldman laid out the final layer of his argument. He pointed to the former president's long-documented connection to Jeffrey Epstein. No accusations. No speculation. Just publicly known history. Social events, shared parties, private flights, interviews where the two men spoke positively about each other. A pattern of proximity that had been widely reported even decades ago. None of that on its own proves what is inside the sealed files. But it makes the extreme secrecy surrounding them feel even more suspicious. The contents of the files are truly meaningless, harmless, and irrelevant. Then why did the push for transparency suddenly disappear? Why did the urgency vanish? Why was the public denied access to information that was once promised openly and repeatedly? Goldman's point was straightforward. You cannot demand transparency for years and then suddenly act as if the truth no longer matters. Not when survivors are still waiting. Not when the public still has unanswered questions. And not when officials made clear commitments they said they would stand by. This subpoena was more than a procedural move. It was a challenge. A declaration that selective transparency was no longer acceptable. That a story of this magnitude cannot simply be buried and forgotten. That law enforcement cannot be used aggressively against vulnerable people while powerful figures are shielded from scrutiny. Accountability does not stop being important just because it becomes uncomfortable. By the time Goldman finished speaking, the room had gone quiet. Some members shifted uneasily in their chairs. Others stared down at their notes. A few looked visibly upset. But the message had already landed. These questions are not going away. The files are not disappearing. And the public demand for answers is louder now than it has ever been. If you believe transparency should apply to everyone, not just the powerless, but also the powerful, then this story matters. Silence protects the wrong people. The truth only comes out when people insist on it. If you found this breakdown valuable, like the video, subscribe for more deep dive coverage, and leave a comment sharing whether you think the files will ever see the light of day. Your voice matters, and staying informed is where accountability begins.